Okay, welcome back to the next part of memory. And today we're going to be looking at what is called the kind of like the way that memory is divided. And one of the systems we use is called the multi-store model. And you're going to want to write that. So at the top of your notes, I want you to write just notes and then the multi-store model. Okay, right across, really big, so that we know what it is. And then what I want you to do, the first subtopic, is basically write it again, multi-store model, and you need to know those names, Atkinson and Schifrin. Okay, and if you want to put the date, you can, 1968. And this is a good idea to make this model, if you like, so you understand it. And it's broken down into basically this model is you have three forms of memory. You have your sensory memory, you have your short-term memory, and then you have your long-term memory. Okay, and then I'll kind of explain it as we go here, a little bit more in detail in the video, but I'll just explain what this diagram basically means. So when we're taking in information, the first thing that takes in all this information from the world is our sensory memory. If we're paying attention, right, we do something with this information, right, and then it goes into our short-term memory. Now, when it's in our short-term memory, and you'll see it's actually really short, right, 30 seconds, but actually your sensory memory is a lot shorter. Once we're here in the short-term memory, we need to do something with that memory. I'm sorry, with that information, right? So it's kind of like a scratch pad of working there, like, jotting down like a post-it type thing. And then if we rehearse it, if we keep on like practicing it, then that is going to go to our long-term memory. And then our long-term memory is forever and it will stay there. And basically, once I need to get what's in here, it's retrieval and then it works its way back out. Okay, so it's kind of like the model. There are these things like the decay, and we'll talk about that as we go. Okay, so once you've made this little model, I want you to, the first kind of subtopic under multi-store model is going to be your sensory memory. Okay, and that's the first one that information comes in through. And our senses is the ones that takes in this information from our world. Okay, and this basically it lasts very like for a few seconds. Okay, um, this information actually goes to the brain, and if we do not pay attention, right, we're writing all this down, if we are not paying attention, then it's going to disappear completely. Okay, so there are two types of sensory memories, and this you need to know. The first one is iconic memory. Iconic memory is basically we're in taking in our senses, our eyes take in information or visual informations from the world, sends it to our brain. But if we're not paying attention, it's gone, right? So it only lasts a couple seconds. Then the second one is echoic memory. And this is when auditory signals, right? So any type of sounds, words, this goes into our ears, pick it up, send it to our brain, keeps it there for a couple seconds. And if we don't do anything with it, it goes away. So iconic memory, for example, you may want to write this down. This is like when you are walking down the halls and you're just kind of like in your own thing, but believe it or not, your eyes are processing this information and sending it to your brain. But if you don't pay attention to it, right, it's gone, right? Because it only lasts a couple seconds. However, let's say that you're walking and you see somebody, your eyes are taking it in, sending it to our memory, and I ask you right there, like, hey, did you see this person or did you see who just passed you? And without even realizing, you'll be able to say what that was, right? But it has to be like seconds from that. So that would be iconic. You're seeing something where you're not really knowing, paying attention, but it goes to your brain. And then if you don't do anything with it within seconds, then it's gone. The next one is echoic. So this one, an example would be, and this happens all the time in the classroom, in which let's say you're not paying attention and you're looking out the window and the teacher asks you, hey, what did I just say? And then you're able to repeat exactly what the teacher said. And then you're like, oh wow, I really was paying attention. But the reality is it wasn't. The echoic memory took it to your brain, kept it there, stored it for 3 or 4 seconds, and then it's gone. But since they asked you right away, you were able to repeat that. But then if I would ask you, what does it mean? Then you'd have a little bit more challenge. It'll be more challenging to really understand. Then you'd have to be like, what did you say? So hopefully that will come up in the class and we could show that live and in person. All right, so that's your sensory memory. Once you pay attention to the information that's in our environment, then it's going to send that information to the working memory, okay? So your working memory or short-term memory, this is going to be your next subtopic. Some people call it short-term memory, working memory, it's all the same thing. Now, short-term memory is just, it lasts literally 30 seconds. So make sure you know how long all of these things last because that is important. So it lasts 30 seconds, and this is where you are actively and consciously trying to process the information. Okay, like you're legit, like trying to take in this information. And this is one of the reasons why when you guys are listening to videos or you're taking notes in class, I'm like, okay, write that down, because believe it or not, when you're writing it down, now you're gonna know all the tricks. When you're writing it down, is you're working with literally your working memory, right? To try to practice it, rehearse it, pay attention to it, so then that information goes to your long-term memory, okay? Now, because imagine if you were just in a class and the teacher's just talking, and you don't write anything down. By the time you walk out that door, you have processed literally nothing, okay? Because you need the working memory in order for it to move forward. So this is where, so write this down, we are processing auditory as well as visual and spatial information. Okay, so make sure you have that. And then the key thing here with short-term memory and working memory, it actually is really vulnerable to interpretation or interference of other information. So this is many times when you're studying for a quiz or a test and you're like cramming it all in, right before the class, and then you get to the class and you're like, you start getting confused with things, and it's basically because you've only kept it in your working memory. You want to take it to your long-term memory, and that is our goal. Now, where is working memory located? And this you're going to need to know. So, and we'll talk about the brain a little bit more, but definitely your memory is, there's many parts, but you need to know that the frontal cortex, right here in the front, is basically where they're saying, the research is saying that this is the most activated section when we are trying to store things into our long-term memory. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about the characteristics of short-term memory, because when this model started, it was kind of like, okay, that's how it went. And then all of a sudden they started doing more research and realizing that, wait a minute, there's more to this short-term memory than what we're talking about. And one of them is this guy, Baddeley, in 2001. He stated that working memory has 4 components, and you're going to want to write this down. It has a phonological rehearsal loop. It has a visual spatial, it's supposed to be visual spatial. Don't worry about sketchpad. The next one is going to be an executive control system. And then this other one of this episodic buffer, okay? And it's basically that, excuse me, that and it's pretty self-explanatory. Phonological is that the sounds, auditory, we're processing the auditory, and then we are also stating it as we're rehearsing. Then that visual spatial, the images. Executive of control is kind of like the control center of the working memory, and then the episodic is kind of trying to work with all of them all together. Okay, now with that being said, there is such a thing as what is characteristics. Hold on, I literally just thought that I've been talking all this time and I hadn't recorded Okay, I am recording. Anyway, so there is these characteristics of working memory, and I want you to write that down under working memory and make that like a little subtopic, which is characteristics of working memory. Now it's not on here. This is kind of that new model that Baddeley came up with. You need to know these other types of working memory, right? These characteristics, and one of them is called memory span. Memory span is basically the number of items a person can remember, and we're writing this down, right? So it's a number of items a person can remember and repeat back using attention, okay, and their short-term memory. So they figured out that the way to test this memory span is by using digits, and we call that digit span. And that's basically how many numbers can you remember and repeat back. Okay, so when you're taking, if you ever taken an IQ test, it's actually part of the IQ test in which you start off, telling the patient, remember, repeat after me, 5-2, and then they'll start 5-2. Then if they get that right, then you add 3 more, then 4 more, then 5 more, until, as I think it's up to like 7 or 8 numbers. If they could repeat it back, then that's where you go with that. But it's definitely a way of testing for intelligence, using digit span. Okay, now there is this thing that it was created and researched by this guy named George Miller, and you may want to write down his name because you never know, it might be in there. But George Miller discovered that there is, and he kind of quoted it, the magical number plus 7, sorry, hold on. It was magical number 7 plus or minus 2, which basically means, and let's put it in like normal people talk, the magical number is, he did research that humans, right, people are capable of remembering 7 items plus or minus 2. So basically, we can remember 5 to 9 items at a time. Okay, it's easier for us. Once we go to that 10, it's a lot more difficult to remember. This is actually why our social security, our license plates, our phone numbers are all they're all between 5 and 9. So quite interesting how that works. And then we get to the next part, which is chunking. So these are kind of strategies of what we could do to keep that information we have in our working memory, what we need to do in order to kind of move it along to the next section, which is our long-term memory. So the next thing is chunking. So these are actually great strategies for you to learn any type of information. You want to learn something and send it off to your long-term memory. These are 2 things that you should do, which is chunking and rehearsal. So the first one is chunking, and chunking is basically this is going to be a way to increase our short-term memory. And chunking is when we group things together. Okay, so like our phone numbers, our social security numbers, we're putting it all in like chunks. When you're writing your essays, okay, when you're writing your FRQs, that is why I tell you guys to skip a line, chunk your paragraph so it's easier to process that information. When you're taking your notes, this is why it's so important to skip lines, because you want to chunk the information from, let's say, like from sensory memory, you want it in one chunk, then working memory, another. But if you don't put lines or space between them, your brain cannot process that, right? So it processes it all. But the minute that you chunk it, it's like it separates it, and your brain could process it better and actually store that information more. So this is why, people, skip those lines, even if it has to be 2 lines, but you should be able to look at your notes from far away and see the divide, because that is how your brain actually processes information the best way. Okay, now you know. You guys are gonna find out all the secrets now of why I do the things I do in the class. So that's one. Then the next thing is rehearsal. Okay, so rehearsal is basically just a excuse me, repeating the information over and over again. Now, you would think like, oh, when I'm about to study for a test, I'm just going to repeat it over and over again, right? The words, and then it'll stick. So that does work to some degree. Like, let's say you have to learn a skit, right? Or a monologue or a piece of, in music or anything that you have to, excuse me, that you have to like learn it for long term. The more you do it, obviously, the more it's going to stick. Now, to elevate that like one more level, if you actually use elaborative rehearsal, which is called write that down. Elaborative rehearsal is that you're basically giving that information meaning. So for instance, if you're learning, like you're studying for this class and you're going over the flashcards, this is why when you have the flashcards, you have examples that mean something to you in order to make sure that you're going to recall it. Okay, because I could repeat a bunch of definitions, and by the time maybe I'll remember it for that short time that I'm taking that test. But the minute I walk out, I'm like, I don't even remember what the words of the definitions of those words are. And we don't want that, because I want you to be able to remember this for years and years to come. And believe me, it will happen. There are many things, not everything, obviously, but there's many of these words that are going to stay with you for a long period of time. But the best way to do it, and really the only way for it to ensure that it stays in your long term memory, is by using this elaborative rehearsal. Okay, so we move on to the next and final step of the whole multi-store model, which is long-term memory. So we're going to skip a line, right? Let's chunk that information. And now you just put long-term memory. And long-term memory is quite fascinating. And I will say they've done a lot of research, but there's still so much research to do on memory and how our brain works. And just it's quite fascinating. There's constantly new things. But so long-term memory is basically what they've said, research has showed, is that it's unlimited. There is unlimited capacity in the long-term memory, that it will fit anything, all the information, and it is permanent. Okay, so it's like permanent and limitless. Now, with that being said, I do want you to write this down, of the word engram, which is basically biologically, so the biological approach looks at memory from obviously the brain, right? The perspective of the brain. And what they've learned, the engram is basically where memory begins in the brain. So it's like a memory trace. And then the more that you do something, and we'll talk about that too, the more you do something, the stronger those connections are made. But engram is basically that first connection, or the first schema, really, of the information in your brain. Now, how does long-term memory work? And I want you to draw this diagram. And so, but under the diagram, we're going to break down what all of these things mean, because you do need to see how they're kind of branched off, and then how they're all kind of connected, right? Like these are connected to the declarative memory, and procedural has to do with procedural memory. So draw this out, and then I want you to make like a subtopic, and I want you to write the first one, which is declarative memory. Okay, so declarative memory can also be called explicit memory. Okay, so they can use either or, but just know both of them. Okay, so declarative or explicit memory is basically any type of conscious effort to remember, like to store something. Okay, so we do this in two ways. Um, we have to do this many times in like an effortful processing. This is more of, we need to pay attention, we need to consciously make an effort to store this information into our long-term memory. And then it's divided kind of into these two types of explicit memory. The first one is semantics. And semantics, you're going to want to also, under declarative, write it under there, like a little subtopic. And semantic memory is basically anything that has to do with like everyday common knowledge, like facts, a general knowledge, your language, and also impersonal memory. So not so much like your own memories, but things like just kind of facts and not experiences. So just general information. Common sense also comes from semantics. Okay. And then the second one is an episodic memory. Okay, an episodic is basically anything that has happened in your life, like an episode of your life. So these are your personal experiences, events, you kind of your stories. And I always think of this just like an episode of Friends, right? An episode of your life, that would be episodic memory. Semantics, and just a way to remember it, semantics means meaning. So it's exactly what we try to do with our, like, any type of facts, things you learn in school. We want to give it meaning, right? It's meaningful in school. So that's explicit and declarative. And then we're going to jump to the second type of memory, which is called implicit memory, or procedural memory. And this is kind of like your step by step how to do something. So for here, this one tends to be an automatic processing. Like we don't, unlike this one that you have to like try, this one happens kind of naturally, but not always. But it happens more this unconscious way. So for here, this doesn't require much conscious effort, right? It's kind of something that we do, but and the way that we retrieve it, and that's key, the way that we retrieve this information has a lot to do with like our unconscious. So from here, procedural memory, and I'll give you some examples so that it makes sense. But from here, procedural memory is also called, like, some call it just procedural memory. It's not like here that it's divided into semantics and episodic. This implicit memory is the same thing as procedural memory. And procedural memory just has to do with basically anything that has to do with like how to do something. So it could be motor skills, actions, your muscle memory. So for example, anything that has to do with, like walking, tying your shoes, learning a piece and on your instruments. So a lot of this comes to you naturally without even realizing it. Another thing would be things that you are classically or operantly conditioned, right? So this has to do with behavioral, where you are reinforced or are punished for something, and it just becomes an automatic response, right? Like, you guys know that you come into a class and you sit down, that you don't just stand up and do whatever you want, because you know that you could get in trouble. So the minute you walk in, you sit and adjust. So that's procedural memory. Okay. All right. And this is a nice little general rule to write down in your notes, that basically implicit is going to affect your behavior or your mental process without much effort. Okay. And then explicit does involve more of this conscious effort to get it out of there or store it. Okay. And we'll talk about that. We'll use some examples to a lot of activities as we go. All right. Now, I want us to talk about flashbulb memory, and this is its own subtopic. It is stored definitely in your long-term memory, but flashbulb memory is basically when you have this um, vivid and clear image or memory of an event. Now, usually that event is either worldwide, and make sure you're writing all this down. So it's a vivid and clear memory. Like, you can, it's a moment in your life that it's usually, well, not usually, it always has an emotionally high It's an emotionally high experience that you have, and when you recall it, it's like very, very vivid. Like you literally can see yourself there. You remember clearly everything. And usually it's an event like a world event. Now it's interesting, like, so my freshmen, they had an essay that they were writing, and they were like so vivid on um COVID time, because they were the ones that were transitioning from elementary to middle school. And wow, like that, how impactful that was. While for others, like, I don't remember so vividly that those moments. But flashbulb memory, and it's not like these vivid memories, it has to do more like it's exceptionally clear, like super details. Like for me, flashbulb memory definitely has to do with 9/11, and I'll explain it in class, like my experience with 9/11. Like still to this day, I can remember where I was, what I was doing, who I was talking to, like if I was living there at that particular moment when I was 21, sitting and watching the TV. So that's more of that flashbulb memory, not so much a vivid that you could remember vaguely, but flashbulb is really, really an intense event that you can like relive it like if it's happening again. Okay.